The luxury and guess flexibility of being an entrepreneur is that you don't need other people's approval to start something, right?
Dom, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Maddie, for having me.
I'm really excited to chat today. You're my first ever food and beverage product on the podcast. So I have 1,000,005 questions that I want to ask you, but I would love for you to start sort of at the beginning of your journey. Why did you come up with the idea for Dirty Water? Also, I should say thank you for sending me some. I tried it and it is truly the most unique flavor I've ever had. So I want to hear all about it.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah. For me also, it's my very first food and beverage sort of thing. So there's a lot of learnings along the way. Yeah. But I would say starting from the beginning, directly before launching Dirty Water, I was in mobile gaming and tech. And so there I was doing a lot of product operations, performance marketing. And so there, and then before that, I was actually in fashion. So kind of went around the block a bit.
Really similar things that you've been doing.
Exactly. Yeah. In fashion, I was doing luxury branding, merchandising, and styling. And so, very different things. But I think they all sort of triangulated me towards this with what I'm doing now, which is, I would say, the thing I'm most passionate about out of anything I've done before, right? And so, I always wanted to do something more brand focused, hence being from the fashion space, something that feels more culturally aligned, whether it's part of the zeitgeist or something that is just more consumable, right? When I was doing mobile gaming and tech, it was very interesting because it was very, very different from anything I was doing in the fashion space, because I was working more so as a publisher. And as a publisher, what we would do is we would acquire or work with games, basically fix them up and then market them and scale them up. And so with that, it was very much a playbook, right? It was very different than, say, you had your own game or a single product and you were building it and sort of doing these very experiential and, creating activations and creating a brand. Where for us, since we were a publisher, it was very numbers driven. And so everything we did kind of reflected that. And so over time, I realized all I was doing was really creating playbooks to optimize efficiency, where what I really wanted to do was the cool stuff, right? Whether it's working with influencers or doing some small brand activations with communities. And I was really missing that part from tech. And I know there are things you could do within the tech sector that feels more aligned with that. But for me, what I really wanted was something really physical and something that, people could really hold on to, repeat purchase. And so out of all of my ideas throughout time, I think this is what stuck the most. And this is what I really wanted to kind of go forward with. And so the concept of Dirty Water for me kind of actually went back to when I was in tech. I was working these very long days. And after my days, I would come home and I would crack open at the time a Bud Light. And so that was my day to day. It was every day just coming home and unwinding with a light beer. But at the same time, I was being a little bit more health focused. When I was at bars, I was drinking more vodka sodas. And so I wanted something that almost felt like a vodka soda, or not necessarily felt like a vodka soda, but more health forward like a vodka soda. So to say lower cal, lower sugar, lower carb, and then, but almost with the same sort of dopamine effect that you would get with a light beer. Yeah. And so that's kind of what started the concept. I eventually found out about hard seltzers, fell in love with them. And then, so for a number of years, I was drinking them. But then after a number of years, I was like, no one's really doing what I originally set out to do, which was create a single flavor, single SKU hard seltzer or vodka soda or whatever it is. That was more beer adjacent. And so I was like, it's been 4 years. No one's made it. So I guess that's enough information to say, it's stood the test of time. Let me just make it myself.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. I'm also curious, were you the type of entrepreneur that had 1,000,000 ideas in their notes app for businesses, or was this really born out of a specific need?
Oh yeah, I definitely had a lot of business ideas, and even talking with other friends who were aspiring entrepreneurs, kind of giving them, different ideas of, oh, is this your passion? You could do X, Y, Z. You could consult. You could start an agency, you could do this and you could do that. And I think like, I've had so many ideas along the way, but I think at the end of the day, they were all ideas that I wasn't necessarily passionate about. It was just things that I think, oh, this could generate revenue pretty quickly, right? And so this is funny because I think this is the least direct path towards monetization out of any of the other things I've done. And so it's the opposite, right? It's like people ask me, oh, well, you're doing this to make money. It's like, yes, but if I really wanted to make money, I'd be doing other things that are much more higher ROI.
Yeah, like I think about, you have a lot of experience in branding and marketing. Like, yeah, you totally could have started a consulting business and you could have been making money like almost immediately, but there's something to be said for the drive. Actually, I was just recording a solo episode, and this is one of the things that I talk about a lot is like your heart really has to be in the business in order for you to do it, because the entrepreneurial journey is so hard and there's really like not a blueprint for any of this, and you're kind of like making shit up as you go. And if you're truly just motivated by money, like it's never gonna, I mean, yeah, it can work, but it's gonna be like an empty process where you do it and then it's not going to necessarily sustain you for a long time because you're like, okay, like I made money. And then I feel like this is what happens sometimes when people, not all the time, this is kind of an overgeneralization, but I think this happens a lot when you have like back-to-back ideas. You do it, you sell it, and then you move to the next thing. But to have a real passion project and something that you're really obsessed with and that you think about all the time, and that's like, also, I think it comes from having been born from your specific needs. So like you already kind of know that there's a target audience for this. And I think something that's also cool about your business is you're probably speaking to like a very specific individual, I would imagine.
Right, exactly. And I think, it's funny. Growing up, it was like, oh, if you want to make money, you have to become a doctor, you have to become a lawyer, you have to do X, Y, Z. And now I think we're in such a opportune time in just like, I guess like human history where like, anyone who has a passion on something can make money from it, whether it's content creation, streaming, there's so many ways. Like if you're the best out of something, or if this is really what you want and you put your full heart into it, you can make money that way and you can make a living that way. And I think that's so unique and such a fun thing about the time that we live in now. It's like everyone can be their own sort of like entrepreneur if it's something that they really have their heart to. Because like to your point, right, if it's something that you're just in it to make money, any small sort of like tick in the road or like, anything that kind of like stumbles you up, you're going to really reconsider why you're doing this. Where if it's something you're really passionate about, like for me at the end of the day, if I got acquired tomorrow or if someone bought me out to like help and like, put me on salary and, do this, and that's how I was getting paid to do it. Right. For me, it's the same goal, which is getting this product out to the public.
Yeah.
And so I think that is like a very strong key. It's like, okay, how much does this mean to you? What are you willing to sacrifice to get that, across the line?
100%. And I think COVID really like unlocked this idea for people where they started to realize that they didn't have to go the traditional route, which I think is something to be said about our parents' generation. Where like, oh my God, anytime I talked to my grandma, it was like, oh, you should do this because it makes a lot of money. And it's like, when COVID happened and you almost started to realize that the quote unquote stable job that you had actually wasn't all that stable, like you could be laid off essentially at any given time. And then people are like, well, if that's the case, then I can kind of do whatever the fuck I want. And people started to realize that they could monetize their passions and that there's another way of living. And like, that's really what gets me excited about entrepreneurialism is I think it ushers in this amazing, like new future of work where we're all driven by fulfillment and purpose as opposed to just like what pays the bills. Like my worst nightmare is the idea that life is just you wake up, go to work, and then you die. Like,
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So I have a question. I'm curious what your experience has been like. Like, I don't know anything about what it's like to start like a food and beverage company. Like, do you have to find a lab? Like, did you start making your own formula at home and then found a manufacturer? Like, what is involved in that process? I guess, like, if somebody were to be starting one today, where would they have to start?
Right. So going into anything that you have no idea where to start, again, we are very fortunate to have a thing called Google or now ChatGPT.
Oh my God,
or TikTok, whichever you prefer, whichever your preferred search method is, we have like a really good outlet for that. And so, you could do a lot by just a quick like search, right? And I think for me, the biggest thing when like going into any industry or any conversation is I don't have questions until I actually know what I'm talking about, because before that it's just like it's just you don't know what to ask, right?
Empty.
Like it's like what am I supposed to be asking here? What am I supposed to be contributing to the conversation?
Yes.
And so the first thing is like getting to those points of like those inflection points of, okay, these are the questions I have. And then, getting deeper and deeper questions. So the first question was, how do I start a hard seltzer brand, or how do I start an alcohol brand?
Yeah.
Right. Thankfully for me, there was two paths here. One, obviously the operational side of, okay, how do I actually start it? But two, there was this one strategic component that an old co-founder of mine, he's actually been in the alcohol business, but on the strategy side as an EIR. So he was able to help me sort of on the strategic part. But that didn't really help me at all when it comes to like formulation, getting it made. And that's like the most important part. It's like, as someone who has been in like, strategic shoes, it's like, okay, I don't need help with branding, marketing, brand identity now. I just need help with like getting this made and bring it out to people.
Like the physical product.
Right. Exactly. Like, it's like, what's step one? Like, how do I get this in my mouth right now? But yeah, the very first thing was like, okay, how do I guess, get it made, just period, right? You hear a lot of stories of people starting like their food and bev brands in their house, which is definitely one way to do it. But I think there's always this point where, okay, well, you made this, it's tasty. Now you have to make it shelf stable, FDA approved, and all these things. And so to get to that point, you have to work with a flavor house or a lab. And so I just skipped my home brewing step and just went straight to a lab. And so, they're called flavor houses. And what they do, they're very specific. They could do anything from like, if you want to make a perfume, a Pop-Tart, like a home frozen dinner, or like, in my case, a hard seltzer.
Interesting.
You work with them and you give them a brief on what you want. If you have something for them to taste, that's great. If not, it's kind of like this nebulous back and forth, which mine was. And yeah, all you do is really say, okay, for me, for example, I want a hard seltzer that has notes of, in my case, it was like pear and lemon, I think. But I want it to taste more like beer, but I don't want it to taste actually like beer, but I don't want it to taste sweet and fruity like a hard seltzer. I want it to be like low cal, like 0 carbs, 0 sugar, no added sugar if possible, no monk fruit, no stevia sweetener. I don't want notes of this. I want notes of like these things. And so you work back and forth a lot to kind of get hopefully an ideal thing if it's possible to be done. And at the end of the day, ideally something shelf stable too. So that process alone, which was very early stage, like step one of like many steps, that took about 10 months of like just back and forth of samples. And that was actually a very stressful time, because that was step one of many, right? Step one is creating something that you yourself like, right? Yeah. And that was like so nerve wracking, because I didn't know what flavor like I wanted, because it was an idea that I've never tasted before, right? Yeah. It's not like, oh, I want a black cherry flavored hard seltzer, because that's been done and you kind of can pinpoint that. But since mine is a single SKU, single flavor hard seltzer, it needed to be something that's a little more nebulous. Totally. And something that like, is sessionable, but also like isn't very specific to one flavor and can be like kind of broadly appealing, right? Yeah. Which was very tough. But
I'm also curious, do you have to pay, like what's the cost structure of that? Do you pay per iteration, or do you do just like a blank cost for the entire top to bottom ideation phase?
I shopped around a lot. It really depends on who you go with. So for me, thankfully, it covered the whole thing, my upfront cost. Some of them were like, oh, you pay per iteration. Some of them were the first 3 are included, and then after that, every iteration is X amount of money. So it really depends on who you choose. If I was a bigger company, what they would do is they would create a brief and then send it to like 5 different flavor houses. And then whoever was the closest to, say, like your vision, that's who they would go with. And then kind of like build off of there. But obviously as a small brand, I didn't have that luxury. So I had to really pick and choose one person. And the flavor house I chose was great. After a lot of back and forths, we were able to get there. And so after that, finally getting and that was, so the most interesting thing here was like, I was never happy with any of the formulation. It wasn't until I started bringing in outside counsel
Interesting.
until like I was like, oh, this actually does have legs. Because like I think you get stuck so you get so anchored on like maybe a previous iteration or like something that wasn't tasting great,
Yeah,
and like those notes kind of like linger on to like the next iterations, and you just have sort of like a bad taste in your mouth from like
literally.
what happened previously. Yeah, exactly. And so for me, like nothing was like hitting a mark, and
Yeah.
I had to bring in other people. I'm like, hey, like, what do you think of this? And they were like, oh, like this is actually like really good. And they were like,
Okay.
this can taste like something. And so I had to kind of reevaluate. And I think that's a great lesson is like really get other people's opinion, especially something that is like CPG that you do need other people. And I should have known this from like mobile gaming, where it's like you do your tests, right? You test your cohorts, you do it early and often,
Mm,
and see how people respond. But for me, I was just like, I don't want anyone touching it until like I feel comfortable with it. But
yeah.
even that, then like I was just like, that wasn't the right approach. It really was get it out there, test it, have other people try it, get feedback, and let that anchor your bias rather than your own personal beliefs.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because I imagine it's kind of like for two reasons. Like, A, I think it's pretty easy to get lost in the sauce. You know, you're just like, and I think we tend to maybe hyperfixate, like you said, on what you think it should be or on a previous note that you gave. And then, like, I feel like, especially with something that's taste, you can get lost so easily. And then eventually, like, everything starts to taste the same because it's all getting confused. But something also that I think is interesting is like because you waited so long to bring in other people, I wonder like do you think it was cuz you were just nervous to share it with other people? Like you weren't sure if it was
Oh,
going to be good enough like and it was almost like a like like you're a little bit nervous, like a little bit insecure about like whether the product is actually good or not.
100%.
Mm.
Not to bring in horoscopes or anything like that, but I am a Virgo, so I
Okay.
guess I am a perfectionist at heart. So like
Yeah,
I was just very nervous to like have other people try something that I thought was like half baked, right? And
totally.
so yeah, I obviously wanted people to try something that was like really like the best thing ever, right? And I
Yeah.
think it's never going to be the best thing ever for everybody, right? So like just having it out there and just having people try it like 75% and something along the way was very, very helpful.
Yeah, I think this is really applicable for anyone listening because no matter what industry, no matter what business you're starting, there's to me like a couple crucial points. Like, I think early stage ideation in terms of like what the actual idea that you're building is, I think is important to keep quiet because that I think could probably kill a lot of good ideas really quickly just based on like other people's opinion, especially if you're not talking to the right people in your life. But there then hits another critical point where it's like, okay, you have this idea. It doesn't necessarily like what is full baked. Full baked maybe is never actually achievable because consistent iteration is just a part of startup and a part of entrepreneurialism. But there does need to come a crucial point when you start to ask people for their opinions. And like even where I'm at with my co-founder, like I'm scared to talk about our business idea with anybody because like I think honestly still I'm still trying to wrap my head around it and I'm still trying to like figure out what it is. But we have an idea, we know what it is. I think just because like the nature of our role is sometimes because we like understand so much of the product and like we are so deep in the weeds, sometimes it feels scary to talk to other people about it because like I think at the end of the day it's just because I don't have all the answers to all the questions and because I don't know what questions I'm going to get asked, I'm like, I don't know if I want to
Yeah,
talk about it.
yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting point because, and talking about, being in the weeds. And I think this is what gave me a small advantage, at least like in these early ideation processes, um, as someone who hasn't been in the alcohol or hard seltzer space before, right? And I think using parallels of me back in gaming, right?
Mm,
I think I would get opinions from very specific people on very specific things because I knew what I was asking them. I knew what I wanted out of them
yeah.
versus asking people who didn't necessarily know or like were not aligned with what I needed to like the sort of information I needed, right?
Yeah.
And I think here something that's more like consumer focused,
Mm,
right? And something that's like ingestible, whatever it is. Me being that end consumer also, as you mentioned, right? Like really helped the process early. I think like shaping it in a very specific way that maybe if I was like someone who's from the industry, I would taste it and be like, oh, this is not traditional, right? In
Right.
the way that I don't think this will ever get to that point, but me coming in without any of that like prior knowledge was able to kind of, navigate in a very unique way to get to what you have, which is I would say like a pretty unique hard seltzer that a lot of industry people are like, wow, this is like amazing. I've never tried anything like this.
Totally. And I don't know if you ever get this way, but like my mind naturally goes to marketing and like thinking about your target audience, which I assume is you. And
Mhm.
maybe this is just me, but I feel like the right answer is to niche down and to focus in on like honestly like I don't know if you do this, but I'm sure you probably use yourself as like your target audience, so that's exactly who you're speaking to, is like to you. And I maybe it's just because like I don't know the answer to this question, but like I feel like sometimes I want to branch out and be like, well, other people can enjoy this also, like not just me. But I'm curious if you've ever experienced that, and if you sort of like have ways that you talk to yourself where you're like, no, just start with this and like see how it goes, and then like A/B test from there. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, for sure. So I think, and this is another interesting thing about like alcohol and the way that I'm positioning my brand. And so like what I want my brand to be is effectively like I'll call it like, I have a couple different names for it, like the dive bar hard seltzer or like the light beer
Hmm.
hard seltzer or like, some adjacent things like that.
Yeah, I feel like the
But,
dive bar seltzer makes a lot of sense. Like
but,
that hits for me.
right, exactly. And like, if you think about it, so my favorite beers traditionally have been like Bud Light, Miller High Life, PBR, like these light, like Modelo, Pacifico, like these
Yeah.
light sort of swelly beers that you can kind of drink with anything. And then thinking about how I've enjoyed those in my past life, with like the different types of people that have been around. And that spectrum is pretty vast. And
Mm.
so like thinking about those sort of sessionable activities and kind of bringing that into how I'm thinking about dirty water, it's like, okay, I'm making this product. Will XYZ possibly drink it? Right? Something that you wouldn't know unless you just brought it out there.
Yeah.
And that could be the same for me, where like a demographic that I just had no idea about really latches onto it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you only get that when really like sharing it out there with the world. Obviously, you do want to focus on the demographics that you think are the most marketable to you and the most obtainable. But I think over time, the interesting thing is like you will find like really interesting pockets and cohorts of people that maybe even easier to market to just because of how they have accepted the product in their own light.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I love about marketing is like, it's really just about testing a theory. You're just like, I think these people would resonate with this messaging on these platforms. And so I'm going to try it and see how it goes. And then, you check the data and then you're like, okay, well, this kind of hit and this didn't. And then you're so like, okay, I'm going to tweak now and like tweak again. And then you just use data to find interesting tactics. Like for my 9 to 5, we for some reason found out that like a lot of churches check our website, which is random because that's like not who we're selling to at all. And like we're like, okay, well, why does that keep happening? Like, and it's just, you just find these interesting little nuggets of information that you can sort of mull over and then use to make informed decisions based on what comes next. And I think that's so great because it takes the pressure off. It's a more like tangible way to try and like market your product without having to stress so much about if it's going to work or not.
Oh, for sure. 100%.
I'm also curious, how did you come up with the name? I love the name. I think it's great.
Thank you. The name actually, it's pretty simple, but I came up with the name actually in college, but now I've kind of have other stories for the name because they all kind of blend together. But
Yeah.
the original origin of the name was, so in college, we used to drink, it was called Natty Light, which was like a light
Yeah, of
beer.
course. Yeah.
Yeah. It's your cheapest light beer you could get.
Literally.
Yeah. And we would pour shots of the cheapest vodka you could get into the beers, and we would call them dirty beers.
Okay.
And so that's kind of like where it came from. And I was like,
Yeah.
dirty beers, dirty water. So the name of Dirty Water has been my notes app since like college.
No way.
Yeah. It was going to be something. It was going to be one thing or another. But I
Yeah.
think it lands really well with the hard seltzer because people ask me, it's like, why'd you call it Dirty Water? And I tell people now it's like, well, taste it and then let me know if it should be called anything else.
Totally.
And so I think that's like kind of fun. And then there's also ties. So there's a thing called in Boston they call their beers at stadiums dirty waters.
Yeah.
So there's a tie to Boston there. I'm not from Boston, but there's a tie there. And then in New York, you call your hot dog water dirty water.
Oh my God, hot dog water.
Yeah, so like the boiled hot dogs, which are
Yeah.
very popular on like streets, like they call the water just dirty water.
I did not know that, but that checks out for me because
Yeah.
like it totally would be.
Yeah,
But I think the name
yeah.
is perfect. It
Thank
makes
you.
a lot
I
of
appreciate
sense. It hits for me. I kind of want to pivot a little bit, and I think your story is really interesting because you've done so many different things, and yes, they might all tie together, but I think like to go from industry to industry in the way that you have is an important lesson for other aspiring entrepreneurs, because I think a barrier to entry potentially is that they're like, oh, I've never, done experience in this. And like, I think a lot of that can be absolved with just simple passion and like a fervor for an idea. But
sure.
I would love to sort of hear your experience and how you've been able to navigate so many different changes.
For sure. I think the luxury and I guess flexibility of being an entrepreneur specifically is that you don't need other people's approval to start something,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I will say, I went from fashion, and then I was doing some of my own like kind of tech things that I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just kind of trying and doing the entrepreneurial thing, and then I went to mobile gaming and working for like a bigger company. And so I needed to sort of explain how I could be fit for this role,
Yeah.
even without expertise. I think that's something that people have trouble kind of like relating from, maybe whether it's like hospitality, right? Whether you're like a server or if you work retail, and like how does that translate to this thing you may want to do, which is like tech or like gaming
Yeah.
or like whatever it is.
Seems
And I think,
unattainable.
yeah, and I think, people think it's unattainable, but I think everyone who is good at their job, right? And by good, I mean like you go in, you put your best foot forward, you are a good employee at the end of the day. There are things that really do translate from one place to another. And I think a perfect example for me, right? I was doing retail, I was doing styling, I was doing merchandising, and I eventually translated that to mobile gaming. And the mobile gaming that I eventually started with was more UI UX, product marketing, and then like a little bit of product. And so the way that I was able to sort of breadcrumb from retail to that was pattern recognition, right? And I think that's the first thing that was like, and I think the hardest thing is people figuring out what they are actually good at and kind of how
Yes.
to translate that into like, verbiage for a resume.
Yes.
And I think pattern recognition was like one of the main things of like talking about, even though I was a stylist, and, one of the main things is working with different body types and different personas, right?
Yeah.
And seeing, okay, well, this person, I could tell off the bat that this person's going to do X, Y, Z. They're going to react well to me doing this, not well to this. They're going to like if I put these few things together. They're going to travel the store this way, right? And so like all these things that you can consider like UI UX, like how are people going to react to even like how the store is navigated, right? Like and that's merchandising, right? Like how people enter the store, they enter from the left, they travel, the jeans are in the back because as a guy, that's what they go in for. And so the jeans are all the way towards the back. So they have to travel through everything else and go into that, right? And so thinking about that, and then also, using that pattern recognition of, I've done this a million times. I've styled so many people, and you're going to like this, this, and this. And the highest conversion, get the highest cart size is by sharing them, these sorts of things together. Being able to kind of tell that story and say, this translates one-to-one to a digital space, it took me a while to get there, to kind of like figure out how I can shape my resume to go from something completely unrelated to another. But once I got there, then it was like much easier to sort of like unravel like a lot of other things that I thought were great attributes of what would make me a good employee.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like you are able to distill both roles into what I guess like I'm considering to be just general life skills.
Right.
Like, and then using that to apply across the board, I think is really interesting, because then it's kind of like you just were able to okay, I think this is very interesting because it essentially just comes down to life skills. Like, what are you good at? And that can be applied in a multitude of spaces, right? Like, I am like a super go-getter. Like anything you put in front of me, like I will do, and I will do like to the best of my ability, and because I like love to exceed expectations. And that applies because I feel like I kind of relate to you a little bit. Like I worked in retail, and then I worked in project management, and then now I work in tech, but I'm also a co-founder, and I also have a podcast, like, and how those things like actually connect, it seems confusing. Like, and I think I've always struggled with my resume for this reason, because it does seem like a confusing story. And I'm like, but when you get me into the interview, it all makes sense. Like you'll see it, and I feel like I can explain it better in person. But the way that you describe it, in the simplicity of like just distilling the roles down to their basic form, and then figuring out how you as a person and your personality traits connects them, makes a lot more sense than trying to like one-to-one the responsibilities of the role.
Right, exactly. I think, relating that to how I am now, as a founder, it's in the beverage industry, one of the hardest things to do is it's door-to-door sales, right? You need to go door to door and like kind of pitch the world on your product. Everyone has a different temperament. Everyone has different priorities. And so for me, I was never the best seller, so to say. And my selling attributes were being able to talk about the product knowledge, and then also pattern recognition, right? And being able to bring those together and doing repetitions, and then being able to figure out what works well, and then, saying that sort of like script over and over. And I think that's what's helped me, is getting over the learning curve of like trying it the first time, trying it the second time, fumbling over your words, and like, eventually getting to the point of like me being comfortable going into a place, knowing exactly what to say, knowing depending on what their feedback is, I have like a couple different ways to pivot. And it is just like, tried and true repetitions. I think that could probably be said with anybody and anything. Just try something enough and you will like get there.
Yeah. And I think entrepreneurialism, so much of it is sales. Like no matter what your business is, you're always selling it all the time. And the only way to get good at that is to just talk about it all the time. Because the irony is that we know our product the best, but often there's a disconnect between how we see it and how we understand it and what we think it is versus how the customers like receive it and how they intend to use it, or like what they resonate the best with. It's not always, I think, what our first thought is going to be. And the only way to figure that out is to just consistently talk about it and try, which like the other irony is that initial getting over the fear of talking about it. Yep. But it's like the most important thing. I realize that a lot of entrepreneurialism is just like talking about your product.
Exactly. Yeah. Like talk about different ways. Like, and I think like what I had trouble with very early was talking about the product like everybody was educated in the space.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's like the hardest thing of how I'm trying to like reposition my pitch in the story. And I'm still kind of working on that, right? Because for me, I go in and I say, this is a hard seltzer like no others. And then they're like, well, I don't really drink many hard seltzers. That's like, okay, well, let me take a step back. Most hard seltzers do this, this, this. Beers do this, this, this. And mine does something that's in the middle. And they're like, okay. So,
so like, cool story, bro.
Yeah. So that kind of also ties into like my immediate demographics of like, needing to educate the customer as little as possible and them understanding the value prop. And I think that's something that helps along the way too, in choosing like who I want to message towards. It's okay, I'm messaging towards the people who understand the product already, understand what they love and don't love about the current situation, and then kind of show them what I have and how it's different than the others. Where like, I know, going to different markets, like I'll have to educate people on. So for example, hard seltzer is really, really big in the States, right? Or at least like certain pockets. But if you go to other countries, they've never heard of a hard seltzer. They don't even drink seltzer to begin with, right? And so like this over there, you'd have to completely re-envision like how you position the product of like, oh, this is not the dive bar hard seltzer because the dive bar, we don't know what this is, right? So it's like, it's very interesting of depending on who you're talking to and like how you even want to like, spill the words. And like, it's funny. I still like calling it the dive bar hard seltzer, but there was one bar I pitched to and I'm like, this is the hard seltzer. I think it would really work really well here. I call it the dive bar hard seltzer. And they go, we're not a dive bar. We're not interested. And I'm just like, didn't mean to offend you.
Yeah.
But you have a pool table in the back. You have cheap beer on the menu. And, but yeah, no, like that also comes down to like kind of knowing who you're talking to and like knowing how they like kind of receive it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, at work the other day, I learned that one of our sales guys sent like a wine gift to a potential client, and he didn't understand why they were like offended that we sent wine. And I was like, "What brand did you send it to?" And he was like, "Dr. Bronner's." And I was like, "Bro, Dr. Bronner's is like a Mormon brand. Like they don't drink alcohol." I was like, how did you not know that? Like, literally, their labels are all Bible verses and like telling the story of Mormonism. I was like, hello. But I mean, it does. It's really like, who's your target audience?
I think so. That's actually a very big learning that I had very early in my just entrepreneurial journey. Was like, I always, when I was very, very young, I always tried building with the thought of scale in mind. It's like,
Yeah,
at the
totally.
highest level and highest scale, would I be doing this thing? And so,
Yeah.
thinking about like, perfect example is sending out gifts, right? It's like, I'm going to create an email list and everyone's going to get this gift and it's going to be shout out to everybody. But that's not how you build a business. Building a business is really going one to one, combing through every single person, personalizing every single thing, even though that's not what you're going to do later on. That's what you need to do now.
Yeah.
To really get the business going. I think that's something that I wish I knew when I was way younger, was like, do the hard stuff. That everyone says that, right? Like, do the hard stuff, do the really grindy things that people don't like, don't want to do, right? Or something that you don't think is meaningful. And I think for me, right, going to every single bar, chasing like $100, $200 check, right? In the grand scheme of things, that may be very small, but now for me, this is brand building and kind of
Yeah.
exactly what it needs to be at this time and place. And as time goes on, as time scales, I'll be able to solve for like a lot of those pain points. But right now, doing the things that are more one to one to every single customer, knowing them by name, knowing exactly what their quirks are, and kind of appeasing each person, because that goes so much further now than later.
Totally. And I think there's something to be said for no matter what industry you're in, when you're at the early stages of your business, like they call it a grind for a reason, because it is. And like, I think that's probably the one consistency across any like solo entrepreneur, is that you will have a period of hard grind and you don't have the luxury to like, you know, necessarily optimize for efficiency, because you're optimizing for results, not for like making your life easier or like skipping past the shit that's a pain in the ass.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think being in fashion, that's helped me a lot here with like white glove servicing, right? Just like giving people exactly what they want, or even more than what they thought they wanted. And I
Yeah.
think that's been able to go like a long way of me being able to communicate in an effective way that makes them feel like maybe better than some other brands do.
100%. Well, I think that's the perfect place to close. Dom, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing chat. I hope it helps anybody out there who's interested in a CPG product, because it's hard work.
Well, Maddie, thanks so much for having me. And I hope everyone enjoyed the chat, and follow your dreams.